We're going to get started this morning. If you are a daily Bible reader, I know we have a few more probably coming in. If you are a daily Bible reader, please raise your hand. All right. So we have with us this morning Dustin. He's a second-year student at the Bible Institute of Missouri. He is originally from Sanford, North Carolina, and he's going to be bringing our Bible class this morning and then bring our morning sermon during the worship hour as well. And so we're going to turn it over to him this morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Well, this is a little small area. I got to watch my voice. My dad always trained me. He said, you speak as if there's no mic in front of you, just in case it cuts out so people can still hear you and understand you plainly. If you want to turn your Bibles this morning, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5 for this morning. Daniel chapter 5. Now, I believe in transparency and straight up honesty. So I'm going to do just that and say this will be the first time I have actually ever taught a Sunday morning Bible class. So, like I do with all the professors at the Bible Institute of Missouri, I'm going to ask for grace and mercy. But we'll get through it. It'll be a learning experience for all of us. But in Daniel chapter 5, there's a lot of interesting things that we read about happening in Daniel chapter 5. We read things that are going on historically, read things that are going on theologically, and read things that are going on morally in this passage. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this a section at a time, and we are going to break it up, and then we're going to go over said section to see what we can learn from each part of this chapter. So in Daniel chapter 5, we're going to start there in verse 1 and go on down to verse 4. Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave commands to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the golden vessels that they had taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king, his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, wood, and stone. So a little background information here. Jerusalem has been destroyed, and the temple has been destroyed already. This took place in 586 BC. That was the last carrying away that Babylon did to Jerusalem as they destroyed that temple. And the year is 539 BC. So just keep that in your mind. It's 539 BC. This would be the last year, and this is actually the last night that the Babylonian Empire would be a world power. Because this very night, the Medes and the Persians would come in and destroy and take over Babylon. But we see Belshazzar do something that we see many kings do of ancients and even today. Many royals and nobles, what they do. And what is that? Well, he had a great feast for himself and for all those in attendance, the nobles and the lords. To put it plainly, they're having a party. In world standards, they are having a good time. And notice, alcohol is most likely involved. And drink wine in the presence of the 1,000, that's verse 1. Verse 2, while he tasted the wine. So notice that. This Belshazzar is most likely under the influence of an intoxicating beverage. And while he is under this influence of this intoxicating beverage, notice what Belshazzar does here. He gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Now, what do we know about the Temple of Solomon? That's my question to you. What do you know about the Temple of Solomon? It was located right in Jerusalem. The directions had been given to David from God. If we turn to 1 Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles, chapter 28. Remember how Peter calls David a prophet in Acts chapter 2? Because David was actually inspired by God. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 19, it reads, All this, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the works of these plans. So everything that regarded the temple, God gave to David so that he could understand what to do and how to instruct Solomon. So that when the time came for Solomon to build the temple, he could do so to God's specifications. Much like how God directed Moses in building the tabernacle. But notice specifically what's being talked about here. If we go back up a little bit to verse 14, and even let's go back up to verse 13. Notice how we were talking about the articles of the temple back in Daniel chapter 5. He commanded the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that they might drink wine from them. Well, these are these vessels here. Also the division of the priests and the Levites for all the work of the service of the house of the Lord. This is verse 13 of 1 Chronicles 28. Of the house of the Lord, and for all the articles of service in the house of the Lord. He gave gold by weight for the things of gold, for all the articles which to be used in every kind of service. Also silver for all the articles of silver by weight, for all the articles used in every kind of service. The weight of the lampstands of gold and the lamps of gold by weight for each lampstand and its lamps, for the lampstands of silver by weight for the lampstand and its lamps according to the use of each lampstand. And by the weight he gave gold for the tables of the showbread for each table, and for silver for the silver table. Also pure gold for the forks, the basins, the pitchers of pure gold, and the gold bowls. These are most likely the very articles and vessels that Nebuchadnezzar, or that rather Belshazzar, is talking about using in his party with his lords, his nobles. And what does Belshazzar do with these articles again? He drinks wine from them. He fulfills his own earthly desires, his own earthly lust with them. Going back there to Daniel chapter 5. And his concubines, that's the end of verse 2, might drink from them. Then they brought out the golden vessels which had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. So these articles of the temple that were to be used in service to Jehovah God, Almighty God, Belshazzar takes those things and makes those things common. Makes them worse than common. Uses those articles used to worship Jehovah God to fulfill his own fleshly desires. But it gets worse as you read. Which have been taken from the house of God, which have been in Jerusalem. Again, the temple has been destroyed here, destroyed in 586 BC. This is 539 BC. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. So not only are they fulfilling their earthly desires, they are worshiping their own pagan gods with these articles of the temple. These articles to use and to be praised to most holy God, Jehovah God. That just takes me back for a second. Because what are they saying about Jehovah? Oh, he's weak. He's nothing. Our gods are stronger than God, than Jehovah God. Why? Because, well, we took out Jerusalem. We destroyed Jerusalem. We'll get a little bit, as we keep reading, we'll see a little bit later on how he is compared directly to Nebuchadnezzar. And how Nebuchadnezzar lifted himself up in pride. Because that's exactly what Belshazzar is doing here. He's lifting himself up in pride against God, as Daniel will later on explain. But Nebuchadnezzar actually humbled himself before God, even though he was the one who destroyed Jerusalem. Interesting thought, though. So, as Belshazzar tastes the wine, is intoxicated with this wine, the golden vessels used to worship Jehovah God are brought out. He drinks wine from them and praises his pagan gods. Do we have any questions up to this point concerning what Belshazzar did, the time frame, the background that we see here, and what happened to the temple? All right, now we'll keep moving. Now in verse 5. The same hour that Belshazzar took this wine, drank this wine, had the articles of the temple brought out, praised these pagan gods, drank wine from these holy relics, artifacts. That's what they were to be. They were to be set apart. In the same hour he did all that. In other words, around the same time, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, his thoughts troubled him, so that his joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. There's a lot that's happening here in this passage. First things first, hand writing on the wall appeared. Now, if you're any king, if you're any person, imagine you're having your fill, you just ate dinner. You know, for me personally, I like to drink some sweet tea, sit on my dad's recliner, which he doesn't really care for, but that's his problem, I guess. But imagine you're sitting there on that recliner, and as you're sitting there, as you're drinking that sweet tea, or unsweet if you're into that sort of thing, and you see a hand appear and starts writing on the wall. Well, I don't know about you, but I would be very afraid. I don't know what that's there for. I have no idea what that is saying. I have no idea what that means. I don't know what I did to deserve that. But that's exactly what happens here. And notice how God doesn't delay this happening. God doesn't wait a couple weeks. He doesn't wait a day. He doesn't wait months. He doesn't wait years as he did with Israel, with Judah. Even though they were in sin, steeped in paganism, he still had mercy. He waited for them. Here, he does not wait. In the same hour which he disgraced God by abusing these articles of the temple, this hand appeared and began writing on the wall. We'll see what that writing is a little bit later. But notice how the king reacts here. Keep in mind, this is the second most powerful man in the world. We'll get to why he's the second here in a little bit. But the second most powerful man in the world. Imagine you're seeing President Biden, which might actually not be too much of a stretch, but imagine seeing President Biden. He's sitting there in the middle of a conference, right? He has power, does he not? He's in a position of power. He is the president of this very nation. Imagine seeing him in a press conference, and in the middle of the press conference, he goes ghost white. And he starts to visibly shake. And his hand starts to point back towards the wall. We would be, what in the world is he looking at? What happened? Is he all right? Is he going to be okay? That's exactly what happens here, verse 6. Then the king's countenance changed. People were able to see a physical change happen in the king's countenance. Most likely, he was pale. Have you ever been sick? Or have you ever been scared, deathly scared, as something was going to happen? What usually happens? You begin to shake a little bit. Maybe you begin to get pale. You have a cold sweat running down your back. That's most likely what's happening here with Belshazzar. His countenance physically changed. His thoughts troubled him. They troubled him so much that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against one another. That would be if it wasn't so terrifying, that would actually kind of be a comedic sight. You know, seeing someone's knees literally knock against one another as he stands there. Again, being the king of Babylon, the second most powerful man in the world. And what did God do to him? He made him shiver in his kingly boots. You want to talk about the power of God? God hasn't done anything yet. All he's done is say some or write some words on the wall. He hasn't rained down fire from heaven. He hasn't sent in an army to massacre all of them at this point. It is just writing on the wall. And this king is deathly afraid. Deathly afraid. And in the divine wisdom of God, we see that the king is afraid, but then it explains why the king is afraid. So we know that he's afraid because of the writing on the wall, but then it goes in further than that. He doesn't understand what it is saying. He doesn't understand what it means. The king cried aloud. This is probably what we would think of as screaming. He's probably screaming for the astrologers and the soothsayers, these wise men of Babylon. Now, why did he call these in? Then the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation. So we have two things there. Whoever is able to read the writing on the wall and tell the king the interpretation, what is the king going to do for that man, shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck. And he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So, he's going to be put in a position of power. But he's also going to be given the clothes to respect that position of power. When you think of royalty, you probably think of that royal purple, golden chains, that golden crown. Well, that is what Belshazzar is going to give this man who is able to read the writing and understand the interpretation. That he is desperate at this point. He is giving the highest position he can give to a man who can make known the writing and the interpretation. But why only the third ruler in the kingdom? Why not the second? The Bible says he is the king of Babylon. Would that not be in his power? That's what Pharaoh did with Joseph, is it not? In Genesis, he made him the second in command, only to Pharaoh. He was a ruler in Egypt. Well, in this particular instance, Belshazzar is actually sharing his rule, or rather, his dad is sharing his rule with him. Nabonidus is his father's name. And him and his son ruled together. There are mixed reports whether Nabonidus is actually here in Babylon at this time, or if he's off fighting the Medes and Persians at this moment. What we do know is that, according to history, Nabonidus actually surrenders to Cyrus the Great. His son would not get that. So his son, the third ruler or the second ruler in all Babylon, is going to give the man who is able to read the interpretation and who is able to interpret it, he's going to give that man the highest command he can, the third ruler in the kingdom. But there's a problem here. Verse 8. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. So, these wise men, in all of their earthly wisdom, all of their earthly knowledge, could not understand the writing. That's what it says there. But they could not read the writing. So most likely this writing on the wall was not in Hebrew, was not in Aramaic, was in a language that was unknown. Truly only God knows, but we can take an educated guess based on them not being able to read it. Because they ransacked Jerusalem. They had those things that they took from Jerusalem, those things they took from Judah. So they would have some Hebrew inscriptions, and they had Hebrews there. Matter of fact, they're going to call on the Hebrew, Daniel. But they could not read the writing or understand its interpretation. And because they could not read the writing or understand the interpretation, then Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance changed, and his lords were astonished. So go back to that analogy we gave of President Biden. Right? I'm not picking on President Biden, I'm just using him because he's our president, he is in a position of power. But again, if we saw him get pale, start to shake, his hand raises up and starts pointing, that's a man of power that is doing that. I'd be astonished. I'd be scared. Should I be scared of that too? I mean, look, here's a powerful man who is scared, a powerful man who is deathly afraid, a powerful man who is terrified, and his lords were astonished. We're astonished that the wise men couldn't read the writing. We're astonished that there is writing on the wall, and we're astonished that the king was greatly afraid at this point because of everything that has transpired. So before we move on, do we have any questions, any comments anyone would like to make? All right, if not, excuse me, brother.
You know, today, even people that aren't Christians, they say, I can see the handwriting on the wall. And they probably don't even know where that idiom that came from probably this. And that, it comes from the Bible. We were founded on Bible principles when they came over from England and things. And so people use that idiom today, they don't even know this is probably where that came from.
And you know what's scary about that idiom is the fact that it's too late. When the writing on the wall, it's too late.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what we read about Belshazzar. The writing on the wall occurs, and as we keep reading verse 31, what happens to him? He dies.
He's going to die.
Exactly.
Today, yeah.
That very night that he saw the writing on the wall, he died. So to use that to the fullest extent, if you see the writing on the wall, it's too late. It's too late. I appreciate that comment. Do we have any other comments, any other questions? All right. Now we're going to keep moving. Verse 10. We're going to go from 10 to 12. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light, understanding, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, in whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Verse 10. Go back up to verse 10. The queen. Now who is this? Would this be the wife of Belshazzar? Well, again, most likely, this would be actually his mother. Now, how many mothers do we have here this morning? That's great. That's fantastic. When your child or your little one is scared, upset, what do you want to do? You want to comfort them. You want to make sure, tell them that everything's going to be all right. You want to calm them down. Well, that's exactly what she's doing here. And because she's in a position of power, and because her son is in a position of power, she's telling him to save face here. Notice the queen, because all the words of the king and his lords. So what were his lords talking about? Well, they were talking about the writing on the wall. They were talking about how the wise men weren't able to read the writing or understand it. And they were talking about how the king was greatly afraid, how he was troubled. That's what I would be talking about. Man, did you see? Again, if we go back to that analogy earlier, what would we be talking about the next day? Did you see what happened during that press conference call with Biden? Did you see how he reacted? Man, that was insane. Is he all right? What did he see? That's exactly what his lords are doing here at this party. They're seeing how Belshazzar, how he reacted, and now they're talking about it. So the queen, when she hears this, she comes in. Came to the banquet hall, the queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Now this is a common greeting. Though this is most likely his mother, he was still in a position of power, and so she shows him respect. But she says, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. In other words, take a deep breath, calm down, save face. Notice how all your lords, all your concubines, all your wives, notice how they're reacting to you. If we see a leader who is greatly distressed, who is greatly terrified, we'll be terrified too. We will most likely be terrified too. So she tells him to calm down, don't let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. And then she immediately goes into trying to solve this enigma, this problem. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. Now this is very perplexing to me. Because she gets it right here, does she not? She says there is a man, she's referring to Daniel. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy God. Is that how we would explain, how we would describe God our Father? He is the holy God, the only God, the God who is set apart, sanctified. So she gets it right here. Even though it's not Yahweh as she's saying, she's perfectly describing Yahweh. The word here is Elohim, commonly used for God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. And then she messes it up. How do you go from the spirit of the high God, the holy God, to the wisdom of the gods? That always perplexed me. It's like she understands that Daniel's God, use air quotes there because it's not his God, but Jehovah God is different than her gods, but she's still not willing to let her gods go. What did Jesus say concerning two masters? You either love one and hate the other, or despise the one and cling to the other. Right? You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot have two masters. You will either serve the Most High God, or you won't. So she is trying to do both, it seems, in this particular instance. We're found in him. Moving on there in verse number 11. We're found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now, your father, a lot of those who don't believe in God and don't believe in the Bible would say that this is one of the reasons why. Well, see, Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father, not Nebuchadnezzar. The word used here for father is Ab in Hebrew. Ab. What other word is very close to that word? Did not Jesus pray in the garden, Abba, Father, Father? Abba is Aramaic for father. A-B-B-A. In Hebrew, it's A-B. I thought that was very interesting. They are very closely related. So the term used here is father. Now, that word, Ab, can be used to reference a biological father, as in an immediate father, or it can be used to talk about an ancestor or predecessor. So, as a matter of fact, the same exact word is used in Exodus. If you turn over to Exodus real fast, in Exodus chapter 3, what is in Exodus chapter 3? The burning bush. Moses going up to the burning bush. Well, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, notice what God says here. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now, was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob Moses' actual immediate father? No. But they were his predecessors. It's the same thing here. The Bible is not calling King Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's actual immediate father. It's more the idea of a grandfather, great-grandfather. If I'm correct, Nebuchadnezzar has actually been dead for, I believe it is 23 years, 26 years up to this point. So Nebuchadnezzar is long gone. But yet, father. So keep that in mind. When it says, King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, it's your predecessor. Your forefather. We have the idea of forefathers, right? The founding fathers of this nation. Are they our actual fathers? No. But they are the ones who gave birth to this nation. So, keep that in mind. Your predecessor, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, what did King Nebuchadnezzar do with this Daniel? Well, he made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. We see this in Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, we see this take place. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, and the King of kings, and the Lord of kings, King of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So, Daniel is over all the wise men up to this point. And notice how he describes God similar to how we would describe God. We call God the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, right? He calls him the God of gods, which isn't correct because there's only one God, Jehovah God. But the Lord of Kings, that's exactly who God is. God lords over kings. Romans 13 explains how God ordained all the governments. In other words, God gave each government authority. But we'll see that a little bit further on. So that's who this David is. This David is the wisest man in Babylon. Now, is it because of David's own ability? Or the ability that God has given him? What's the ability that God has given him? Let that also be a lesson for us today. As we go on through life, are we wise because of our own abilities? Well, let us not say that. But we are wise because we have the commandments of God and we obey them. The wise builder is the one who hears the word of God and does them. That's who the wise builder is. So, this Daniel, the chief of all the wise men, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, made chief of all the wise men. Verse 12. Inasmuch as excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. She goes to the right source almost. She goes to a man of God. She needs to be going to God himself. In times of trouble, who do we turn to? Well, we need to turn to God. It's always great and it's fantastic to have friends and family. But in times of darkness, one can always turn to the Lord. So whenever you're in that rut, or whenever you go through bad times in this life, it happens to all of us. And it will happen to all of us. I believe it's 2 Timothy 3:12 that says, yes, all that who desire to live godly will suffer persecution. We're all going to go through hardships. And times of those hardships, what do we need to do? Look to God. Go to God. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel. They were found in Daniel because God gave him the ability to do such. God gave him the ability to explain these problems, to solve these riddles, to interpret dreams. Whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let this Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. If Daniel was here, I imagine he would give a response much like Joseph. When Pharaoh called Joseph in to interpret his dream. He said, I heard you can interpret this dream. No, it's not. I did not give the interpretation, but it's God who gives me the interpretation. That's who is going to give Daniel the interpretation of the writing on the wall. So we see Nebuchadnezzar, or we see rather Belshazzar. I'll probably do that a couple times. Just know, most likely I'm referring to Belshazzar if we're in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar, his mother comes in to comfort him and counsel him to call in Daniel. Do you have any questions, any comments at this time? All right. Now let's keep going. Verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Are you that Daniel, whom is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought to Judah? I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and astrologers have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. All right, going there, back up to verse 13. It's interesting now that Daniel was brought in. He wasn't brought in earlier with the rest of the wise men. He has to be called in separately. Now why is that? Well, it was customary back then for when a king died, so did the laws that he put in place. If the other king that came up after him wanted to make those laws and keep those laws going, he would. But in concerns with Daniel, most likely after Nebuchadnezzar died, they probably did not want a Hebrew being over all the wise men in Babylon. So most likely Daniel was stripped of his position of power, being the chief astrologist. Because notice how it's in the past tense, a couple verses earlier. There, how he says, or how the queen says to Belshazzar, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, he made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. As in, he is still not, at this moment, he is not the chief of the astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Again, they probably didn't like the idea of a Hebrew being wiser than all of them. But the reason he was wise was because God gave him that wisdom. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel?" He at least has a little bit of knowledge of who Daniel is. We'll go on later on, probably not today because time will not permit, but we'll see how Daniel will explain. You knew everything I just told you. You knew about all of this. Yet you still lifted your heart up in pride against God. But here it seems that he does have a little bit of knowledge. Maybe it's the knowledge that his mother just told him. But regardless, he does have knowledge of Daniel. Are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah? It seems that he wants to make sure they each know their position. Notice how he doesn't call Daniel a wise man, the chief of wise men. He calls him a captive. He's trying to maintain the position of power. You are a captive. I am on my throne. I am the king. I am still in control here, even though he very much is not in control. He is not in control at all. He has already lost control, though he does not know it. From Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, my predecessor, brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you, which is all true. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing, make known to me its interpretation, but they cannot give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if, notice how there is a direct comparison there. He goes and listen. All my wise men, all the soothsayers, all the astrologers have come. I've brought in, and they couldn't even read and understand the writing. If they can't read and understand the writing, why can you? How can you? Now, if you can read me this writing, there's a clause there. There is an agreement to be made, a condition there. If you read this writing, which means if you can read the writing, if you can make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So to Belshazzar's credit, he at least gives Daniel the same condition, the same reward, even though it's not going to be much of a reward if the kingdom is going to be destroyed that night. The same reward as the wise men. The same conditions are to be met. So the king issues the challenge to Daniel. Read me the writing. None of the wise men can do it. None of the astrologers could do it. But I heard you can't do it. So read it. Interpret it. And I will make you the third ruler in the kingdom. But notice how Daniel knows that the kingdom isn't going to last. Because immediately in verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel knows the kingdom is about to be destroyed. Well, how does he know that? Well, through inspiration of God. Again, how good would this position be to be the third ruler of a kingdom that is going to end that night? It doesn't make any sense. So, give your rewards to another. But Belshazzar is still the king. So Daniel doesn't say, well, you guys are going to die. I'm not going to make known to you the interpretation. It's fine. No, he still subjects himself to the law of this king. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So Daniel still had a law to fulfill. He still had something to show this king. And what was that? That Jehovah God was with Daniel, but against this king. Now we're going to skip the next couple verses, and we're going to go down to verse 25. And there's a reason I'm going to do that. When we get to Tekel, we'll understand. And this is the description that was written, verse 25. Mene, Tekel, and Upharsin. This was the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Literally reading numbered, weighed, and divided. That's what Mene, Tekel, and Upharsin means. Numbered, weighed, and divided. Many, numbered. Now, as verse 26 explains, this isn't some random number on the wall, but rather something had been numbered, or how we would say it, something had been counted. And what do you notice about that word, counted, numbered? It's in the past tense. As in, it's already happened. But, well, hold on. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Well, the kingdom was still reigning and finished it. What do we know about God's word? What do we know about God's promises? When God says something, when God gives a promise, it's going to come to pass, is it not? We would say it's as good as gold. No matter what happens, God's will come to pass. So when God said, when Jesus says, I am coming again, what can we have comfort in? That he is going to come again. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Though it may be the Persians that are going to come into Babylon and to ransack it and take control of it, who is the one who has the authority to do that? Who is the one who actually destroyed the Babylonian Empire? Well, it was God. God is the one who numbered the days of the Babylonian Empire and finished it. God is the one who sets up, who takes down, who builds up and destroys. God is the one. Again, going back to Romans chapter 13, who is the one who ordained all these governments? That's God. God's the one who did that. So, we need to respect them. So God has numbered the days of your kingdom and has finished it. It's destroyed already, even though it's not. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. What a terrifying thought. So put yourself in Belshazzar's shoes for a moment. You're having a good time. You're with your friends. You're with the nobles. No. Writing on the wall appears. You become terrified. You can't read it. You don't understand what it says. You don't understand what it means. You don't understand what that saying means. No. What does numbered, weighted, and divided, what does that even mean? What is that in relation to? So you call on your wise men. You call on your wise men. Now they can't understand the reading and the writing. So now you become even more terrified. Your mother comes in, calms you down a little bit. Okay, call in Daniel. You call in Daniel. Daniel is now telling you what it means, and he is saying that your kingdom is going to be destroyed, and why is it going to be destroyed? Again, the wisdom of the scriptures here, the wisdom of God. Why is it going to be destroyed? Tekel, weighed. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. So God tells them your kingdom is going to be destroyed. This is why your kingdom is going to be destroyed. Now again, this isn't in relation to the other number, as in to say it's the king's weight on the table or on the wall. Right? God did not sit there and say, well, Belshazzar, I think you need to lay off the food a little bit. You know, you weigh 650 pounds. No, that's not what's being discussed here.
I think it's like weighing the balances. I mean, that's what he said there. It's a judgment that he had. Like we have the symbol, you've seen the balances of judgment, and that's what this is a reference to. God has judged Belshazzar.
That's exactly what it is. God has judged him, and he has measured him to a standard. There was a standard that Belshazzar was to meet, and he did not meet that standard. But what was that standard he was to meet? It is my personal belief that it is Nebuchadnezzar. Well, why would he use another pagan king? Well, right before all of this takes place, and Daniel makes known to him the interpretation, he contrasts Nebuchadnezzar with Belshazzar. Right there. And we are almost out of time. But just to sum it up, he explains how Nebuchadnezzar lifted himself up in pride, God punished him for it, and he humbled himself. Here, what did Belshazzar do this night? He lifted himself up in pride. God is going to punish him because he will not humble himself. He has the opportunity to humble himself. In verse 22, but you, his son, his descendant Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. And here's the kicker. Everything from verses 18 to 21, Belshazzar already knew. He already knew everything that Nebuchadnezzar went through. Let that be a lesson to us today. What do we know? We know how to gain eternal life. Will God give us a pass if we do not obey it? He didn't give Belshazzar. And that may be why he was punished so severely. Because he knew all this and still did not obey Jehovah God. The last one there is Perez. Your kingdom has been divided, given into the Medes and the Persians. Again, it has been divided. It's already taken place. There's nothing that this king can do to stop it. And how does this all end? Verse 31. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. So because he mocked God with using the articles of the temple to worship his pagan gods, which, by the way, in verse 23, Daniel explains, which do not see, hear, or know, so those gods are useless. Because Belshazzar did all that, he lost his very life. Because he did not humble himself before God when he was in sin, he lost his life. We will do